our special guest speaker. And before we get started with that, I wanted to hand things over to Janet Whaley, who is going to tell everyone here a little bit about the fundraiser we've got going online. Janet?
Thank you, Nick. For those of you that have not seen the email on this yet that was sent out, probably about 2 weeks ago, we have a wonderful donor who has given us 3 signed, numbered, framed, matted and framed pieces of artwork. They're very large format art pieces by 3 different artists, John Duillo, G. Harvey, and a very rare piece from Don Troiani called The Last Salute, which portrays Chamberlain and Gordon at Appomattox. That one in particular is very hard to find. It's only available on the secondary market now. So because we got this great donation and because we can't gather together at our meetings to do an art auction live, we have set up a lovely art auction online website. And that was sent to all of our members about 2 weeks ago. The auction is open through December 13th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, which is 9 a.m. for us. And you can look at the artwork, you can see the measurements, get a description of the art pieces, and decide whether or not you'd like to bid. And if once you've signed up to bid on an item, if somebody else places a competing bid and outbids you, you will be notified by this program that you've been outbid so that you can put another bid in at a higher amount. The website is www.biddingowl.com/Pasadena CWRT. So you can go on that online now and check out the site, check out the bids. There are minimum bids for each of those pieces based on their values on the open market. We will be sending out another reminder to all of our members on our email list right around December 1st to keep you apprised of what's going on with the art auction, but we're hoping that you'll take advantage of it. This art auction will benefit battlefield preservation. So your donation over and above the retail value of the artwork is deductible as a charitable contribution because we are a 501c3 organization. So I hope that you'll take advantage of it. It's a great opportunity for us as a roundtable to be able to put these pieces out to our membership. We've also got national coverage through the Civil War Roundtable Congress. So there are national bidders bidding on these who are going to pay for the shipping if they happen to win the prize, the piece. And we hope that you'll take advantage of it to help support battlefield preservation. Thanks, Nick.
And actually, I'm going to hand things over to Janet again because Janet is going to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, as Michael isn't here.
Nick, did you want to talk about our next program in December, our show and tell?
Oh, yes, I can do that. Traditionally, every December meeting, we do what we call a show and tell, and that has been a lot of fun. It would be nice to have even more people participating, but this format makes it a little bit tricky. So we're trying to work out the details of the best ways to present things. The whole idea of the show and tell, though, is for something where if you've acquired something or learned something during the year that would be worth a short presentation to the group, but not worth doing a full presentation, like 5 minutes versus 45 minutes. The show and tell is your opportunity to do that. In the past, we've had pieces of artwork, books, weapons, all sorts of things presented in person. This time it would have to be something where you'd be able to present it on your computer screen. So just bear that in mind, and if you come up with something, feel free to share that. And we'll be doing that on December the 22nd, I believe is the date of the 4th Tuesday in December. And so that's what we have in mind. And we'll be announcing the January through spring presentations very soon. For those of you who haven't noticed, we're still in the middle of a bit of a lockdown. And in addition, until this last week, the library auditorium we've been using wouldn't have had any place to sit. The restored seating for the Pasadena Library's auditorium has arrived and been installed. I finally had a chance to go in there myself and sit in one of the seats. It's basically, they look just like before, but they don't have those annoying springs that pop out and rip your clothing to shreds. So that's a good thing. Those other seats were reupholstered 1920s seats. And so they've replaced them with 1920s looking seats that are 2020 seats. So, but the framework and things like that are still there. And so it looks really nice. But I don't expect us to be able to use that auditorium again until next summer, the way things are going. We want to be able to meet safely, and that's going to require the vaccinations being distributed to enough people to make the gatherings safe. And that the estimates I've been getting from everyone for gatherings in Southern California are to not look for those before next summer. So we'll be doing things online for another few months, we hope. And I hope you all stay well while we're doing that, and look forward to this meeting tonight and to seeing you next month. Now over to Janet.
In regard to our lineup for next year, we already have a really good speaker set for the fourth Tuesday in January. You may have heard of him. His name is Gary Gallagher, and he's going to be presenting to us from back east. So he's staying up late to be able to present to us California time. And he does have a new book out, which he's going to be talking about. And we hope that you'll put that one on your calendar for the fourth Tuesday in January. But tonight, we have a very special speaker with us. I have had the pleasure of knowing Brian for several years. We served together to staff the Drum Barracks Civil War Museum booth at the Civil War reenactment in Huntington Beach, and we got to know each other for that. And he told me about his interests, and I thought that that would be a perfect program for our Civil War Roundtable. So I'm thrilled that he's going to be with us tonight for this. Brian has over a decade of experience in historic sites and institutions in the LA area, with an emphasis on museum education and collection management. He's served as a museum guide at the Drum Barracks Civil War Museum and has started volunteering there in 2010 at the age of 15. So who says that history is dead for young people? I think that he's a perfect example of starting early. He also has worked for the City of Los Angeles Department of Recreation and Parks at the Drum Barracks Museum to educate the general public on LA's Civil War past through tours, exhibits, and lectures. And today, Brian continues to volunteer at local historic sites such as Rancho Los Cerritos, and to work as a gallery and collections coordinator at his local historical society. He received his AA in history from Long Beach City College, a BA in history from the University of California at Los Angeles, and he's currently completing an MA in history with an emphasis on early Mexican-American communities in the borderlands of the American Southwest from Cal State University, Long Beach. So I am thrilled to have Brian Chavez with us tonight, and I hope you enjoy his program.
Thank you. So is that my go-ahead?
You're on, Brian.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Brian Chavez. I don't have to introduce myself anymore, so I guess that's easy. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is that this pandemic has definitely changed a lot of things for almost everybody. I mean, it really has for everybody. And part of that involves adapting to new circumstances, which is kind of the story I'm about to tell today. And I've had to adapt myself in various ways, including in how I do research and the story I tell. This is a story, as Janet mentioned, that I had mentioned to her about a year ago at the Huntington Beach Civil War days. It is a fascinating tale of Latin American communities getting involved in nation building in the constructs of war, in the constructs of national identity. It's a really, really fascinating story, and I hope that the story I'm about to tell you encourages you to look further into this and do your own research. And on that note, my research has definitely shifted within the last year because of the lack of available sources that originally I was supposed to have contact with. At the start of the pandemic, I was supposed to go to the Santa Barbara Mission Archives to look at the De la Guerra family papers. Then I was going to head over to Berkeley and look at the Bancroft Library and some of the sources there, and eventually go up into Sonoma and look at some of the sources there for the Vallejos. And then hopefully spend a lot of my time digging into the LA ones because LA is a central part of this narrative. Unfortunately, the pandemic has halted a lot of that research, and I've had to reshift a lot of that because the thesis still has to continue. I'm still in school, and I want to get out of school. Not that I don't love it, but I want to move on. And so the research has shifted to look more at California populations in Los Angeles specifically, and how they navigated the changing times of the American Civil War. So it's going to be a cross between some of Leonard Pitt's argument in Decline of the Californios with a renewed taste, more of Carlos Salamon's take on California agency, and also blending in a new perspective on a favorite of probably many of you. Where is it? I thought I had brought it, but Los Angeles in Civil War Days, which is a classic for many of us for sure. I know many of you have already read it before, and taking a new refreshing perspective that engages the Spanish-speaking communities a lot more. So my research has changed, but nonetheless, this is still a topic that I'm really very much familiar with, and we're going to look at a broader story that again is about adapting, which is something that we're doing today in our present. So. After deciding I wanted to write a thesis on the Californios in American California, I began to explore potential subtopics of study. In the process, I was led to a unique historical situation. A brother, two sons, two wars, all on many fronts. This was the case for Californio Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, a proud native-born Californian, statesman, prominent landowner, and former general to the Republic of Mexico. The American Civil War had a reputation of pulling families across distant fronts. For Mariano and his family, this reality was no different, but the story was quite unique. In the Southwest, Mariano's younger brother, Jose Manuel Salvador Vallejo, a former captain in the Mexican Army, now served as commanding major of the 1st Battalion of the Native California Cavalry, a Union Army battalion comprised primarily of Mexican Americans and Native Americans. In the Atlantic East, Mariano's son, Platón Vallejo, served as a Union Army surgeon near Washington, D.C. And south of the US-Mexico border, Mariano's younger son, Vladislao Vallejo, fought with Benito Juárez and his rebels against French-controlled Mexico. Even Mariano himself was not free from the pull of civil war. Though not serving in the military, Mariano played an influential political role as a Hispanic Republican and Unionist in California. His prominence in the state, most importantly among the Spanish-speaking populations, even granted him an audience with President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. This moment in the lives of Californios marks a turning point that defined the future of their survival in American California. So this historiography, so I had that interesting story come up in my early preliminary research. And in order to for me to write something new, I needed to obviously understand what was already there. And what historians are really, there's a lot of historiographic trends that I was looking at. And one of the most important ones is the Grand Reconstruction narrative, which also blends into Borderlands theoretical framework. And that's, Borderlands itself is an older term that essentially says there are these competing groups in contested lands, in contested territories, in contested borders. And essentially part of that in terms of American borderlands is the battle between the Spanish, the indigenous populations, later Mexico, and then the Americans, and all these different groups coming into contact with each other and establishing borders or contesting those borders. Playing into this is this grand Reconstruction narrative. We all understand Reconstruction as this post-Civil War period of trying to grapple with the reincorporation of the American South, which also now incorporates freed peoples that were once slaves, and trying to assume them into this new American nation. In the grand Reconstruction narrative, which is a new historiographic trend in American Southwest studies, it basically says that no. The Reconstruction didn't necessarily start after the Civil War. It actually started after the Mexican-American War. As soon as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, immediately you have the incorporation of thousands and thousands of new people of different backgrounds that were already there, that had already established communities, politics, religions, and now have to become part of the American way, to simplify it. And so that historians are saying that begins the process of American Reconstruction into the modern nation that we get at the turn of the century and into the 20th century. There's also this idea about transnationalism that comes into this, and understanding that there is multiple nations coming into contact with each other, and a failure to ignore the nations that surround the United States is a failure to fully understand the historical record. So in the case of the American Civil War, you need to understand the indigenous nations in the American Southwest, and you need to understand the Mexican nation in order to understand the Civil War in the American Southwest. In terms of how this intersects into California discussions, Californians were often kind of seen as not necessarily doing the best job at surviving American annexation and essentially declining. And that's famously, I mean, the kind of paramount monograph that discusses this is The Decline of the Californios by Leonard Pitt, which basically says that the Californios had an inability to come together and form a cohesive group that could counter the increasingly Anglo-Americanization of California, and essentially their inability to combat the rapidly changing period resulted in their decline. And historians are now challenging that, and I'm one of them, and hopefully I'm successful. We'll find out. But now that you understand kind of some of my backgrounds in framework and historiography, let's go on into some historical questions. So some of the questions that I had involve what did it mean to wake up, well, to one day go to sleep as a Mexican or a Californio, and then the next day wake up as an American? What does that mean? That was a question that was proposed by one of my professors in a course on nationalism and American culture. And it's something that I hadn't ever really thought about because I myself have not had to grapple with that. I grew up here and I've never changed to a different country or to a different national allegiance. So it's definitely an interesting question that I definitely asked myself in this case. And did it change, right? So did once you became American under, let's say, a treaty or paper, did you change to assume the identity of that new nation? Did you call yourself an American? Did you call yourself a Mexican? Did you still call yourself a Californio? And so that was one of my central questions. But there was other questions like, how did Californios combat the rapid change brought by American annexation of California in the American Civil War? What did it mean for Californios to fight for a country, the United States of America, they once fought against? Why did Californios fight for Confederate and Union armies? And what does that tell us about the fluidity of Californian loyalty? Why did Californios support Juarez or Maximilian if they regionally isolated themselves and remained indifferent to Mexico in previous decades? And so hopefully I answer some of these questions in the following. But first, let's get an introduction. Who are the Californios? The Californios are native-born Californians born in Spanish and the Mexican periods of California. They historically saw themselves as elite landowners, the descendants of Spanish nobility, the caretakers of Alta California. They regionally distinguished themselves from other Mexicans who they called Mexicanos de la otra banda, from another branch of the Mexican nation. They also distinguished themselves from non-Christianized Indians, calling themselves la gente de razón, people of reason. Their economy, politics, and society were shaped by a ranching culture not unlike Mexico's hacienda system, where rancheros managed vast lands and Indian labor maintained them. Vallejo, Pico, De la Guerra, and Dominguez were among the most prominent of the California ranching families, though they were not the only ones. These families ruled Alta California. Feeling disconnected to Mexico City, they often served as its body and government, preferring native-born Californians to Federalist tyrants. With the American conquest of California in 1848, Californios inevitably faced the harsh reality of becoming a conquered people. Their claim to elitism, regionalism, and seeming absolute control over California could no longer survive, at least not in its original form. From the moment of California's acquisition, promises of equality and protection for Californios under the flag of American citizenship were broken. The gold rush of 1849 rapidly changed the entire population of California. The mass influx of immigrants from all over North America and across the globe rapidly reduced the Californio influence, as they were overshadowed by the state's total population of 100,000 to only 13,000 Californios in 1849. Furthermore, rancheros like Mariano Vallejo found themselves in legal crisis over the validity of their Spanish and Mexican land grants. The land law of 1851 forced Californios to provide legal proof of ownership to an extensive acreage of California that they possessed. Time and the cost of legal services were not in their favor. As a result, many lost the majority of their original lands. The law's drafter, Senator William Gwynn, and his many Anglo-American supporters hoped the bill would encourage Yankee homestead, stating, directly on the land of old claimants, and thereby force the latter to relocate, end quote. Furthermore, racist government policies and law enforcement reduced Californios to marginalized second-class citizens. For instance, the Greaser Law of 1855 allowed officers to stop, question, disarm, and detain any suspicious-looking Mexican or Californio or indigenous person. Thus, the criminalization of Mexicans became normalized and protected by law. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo violated. In response to this immense change, Californios adapted to their new realities and molded the foundations of their future in American California. And I would argue that no period best describes this than the American Civil War. Once an anti-federalist demographic that favored a feudal landowning class as the rule of law, their politics in the midst of the American Civil War demonstrate a citizenry demanding a seat at the table with increased national and federalist identification and rhetoric. The Union did well not to underestimate the strength of Californios or even Latinos in general, for their allegiance lay with the power who could secure their rights promised under the treaty just signed 13 years before. 2 months into the American Civil War, federal troops invaded the heart of Virginia with the hopes of quelling an unthinkable rebellion by the southern slaveholding states. As the Battle of Big Bethel raged in Hampton, Virginia in June of 1861 with no clear Union victory in sight, Washington additionally drew its attention towards contested loyalties and unsteady peace in the American Southwest. In Southern California, the stability of Union loyalty rested on the ability of government officials to secure the support of the Spanish-speaking population. With secessionist pressures mounting in the state, the Lincoln-appointed Survey General to California, Edward Fitzgerald Beale, yes, the camel guy, requested that the most respected Spanish-speaking family in the state make their loyalties publicly known. Beale's letter to the patriarchs of the family, Andres and Pio Pico, stressed an urgency to clarify the existing doubts over their positions to maintain the present federal government of the United States at all hazards or favor the secession of this state. In response to Beale's request, the Picos pledged their full support to the Union. Unionists and government officials alike took a deep sigh upon hearing this response. For the moment, California was secured. And I will mention that it wasn't always secured. There was always a constant threat that at any point, the loyalty of the Spanish-speaking populations could at any point turn. And it was very, very important for the Union that they secure those loyalties. Why the Survey General was requested, I don't really understand why he was the one requested to ask the Picos this question. I would argue that the Survey General himself was encouraged by his own personal motivation, understanding the importance of securing California in the Union, but also he had a lot of territory that he owned, and he had friends that owned territory, especially in Southern California, where there was the most amount of secessionist kind of feelings. So he even at one point, when the military was deciding to move Fort Tejon to Los Angeles, or everything that Fort Tejon encompassed, the men and the supplies, the camels included, to Los Angeles, the Survey General encouraged against it, fearing that removal of the soldiers from Fort Tejon would then give way to indigenous populations occupying the region, and a region which he had property, and so did many of his friends. So it's a very interesting circumstance. So I'm not necessarily sure if it was Union loyalty or his desire to secure the land in the area. Eventually, we understand that Fort Tejon was decommissioned and later recommissioned during the war. So they did not listen to him. But nonetheless, his asking of the Picos is really important, and here's why. Led by prominent Californio Andres Pico, the Pico Act of 1859 demonstrates a point in which elite Californios formed an alliance with the slavery faction of the Democratic Party, the Chivalry, in order to divide the state of California into two and form a Californio pro-slavery Democrat-controlled territory of Colorado. The territory was to assume a portion of the Arizona Territory and southern half of California. This moment must be understood as one in which Californios were not necessarily supporting the extension of slavery, but rather their survival in some ways depended on it. Various implications drove Californios to this alliance and desire for state division. Among them, the California Gold Rush, increased immigration, the Land Law of 1851, and the Greaser Law of 1855. These implications posed a threat to elite Californios' ability to secure hegemony over California. Therefore, the Chivalry, or Chiv Alliance, and the success of the Pico Act were vital to securing political hegemony over a portion of the state. The vast majority of the California population lived in the lower region of the state, pushed out by the mining populations and squatters of the growing north, and politically overshadowed by the larger non-Hispanic population in the north as well. Furthermore, Southern California remained predominantly a Spanish-speaking region, a space where Hispanic language and culture could retain its strength. Through success of the Pico Act, the Californios believed they could secure the control they lost over California in the population boom of the 1849 gold rush and subsequent marginalization. Scholar Daniel Lynch, in his examination of the Chiv California Alliance, notes the inherent irony of it all. He demonstrates the unique contradiction that Chiv leaders were responsible for the costly effects to Californios for the land laws, anti-Mexican legislation, and overall racism. Further still, Andres Pico was himself of African descent, yet his party supported the enslavement of Africans. Even in Pico's day, this alliance was not free from criticism. After racist pro-chivalry remarks were uttered in the San Francisco Herald calling Californios a disgraced race and difficult to distinguish between Indians and the Black race, California political activist Francisco P. Ramirez did not hold back his criticisms. Ramirez called out the ironic Chiv California alliance by stating, "After so many insults and affronts, one still sees the sad spectacle of Hispanic Americans supporting the slavery party with their votes." He and many other Californios understood the contradictory racial implication of supporting the Democratic Party. Instead, he called for and helped form self-built Latino communities that called out the injustices they faced. And I'll touch more on him in a bit. The PICOS Act passage by the California legislature was overshadowed by the highly contested election of 1860. Lincoln's victory resulted with the secession of South Carolina on December 20th of 1860 and led to the eventual secession of more southern slaveholding states. The chivalry presence in Los Angeles and the high number of pro-chivalry Californios in Southern California place heightened suspicion on the historically separatist region. Right as the first shots of the war were fired, Brigadier General Edwin V. Sumner, in command of the Department of the Pacific, reported on Southern California stating, "There is more danger of disaffection at this place than in any other in the state." There were fears among politicians and military officials on the Unionist loyalty in Southern California from not only pro-chivalry Californios, but the loyalty of Latinos as a whole, for they comprise the majority of the region's population. Following the historiographic trends of borderland studies of the American Civil War and the Southwest and Greater Reconstruction narrative, I affirm that not only did the United States have to consider navigating the divisive politics of California, but it too had to negotiate with its demographics if the state was to remain in the Union. From the election of 1860 to the close of the Civil War, California's continuity within the Union was not once fully guaranteed. Secession remained a consistent threat, often associated to the historically regionalist, anti-federalist Californios. In the midst of rising civil strife in the spring of 1861, Los Angeles Army Captain and Assistant Quartermaster, who you might be familiar with, Winfield Scott Hancock, warned the Department of the Pacific, when once a revolution commences, the masses of the native population will act, and they are worthy of a good deal of consideration. If they act, it will most likely be against the government. In the Hispanic eras of California, the Californios felt disconnected to Mexico City. They often served as California's body and government, preferring native-born Californians to Federalist tyrants. Hancock knew well that any attempt to limit their control of the region often accompanied civil war. Now, they had good reason to fear these people. They were a very, very powerful group. They were able to mobilize people, especially in terms of politics, able to mobilize even Mexican immigrants that then became citizens to vote for the Democratic Party. And often there's controversy about the 1850s, the elections that occurred in the 1850s, about Democrats getting indigenous and Mexican peoples who did not have the right to vote to get away with voting in favor of gifts or bribes, rather. So there's kind of some weirdness with that in terms of Latino population supporting the Democrats, but we understand that there were more prominent individuals of the Californios from prominent families that did strongly support the Democratic Party. And part of that, again, comes with this idea that through this alliance and through the creation of the territory of Colorado, or at least assuming control of Southern California, the Californios could once again have some form of control over a California that they feel they're consistently losing their grip over. When it came time to war, they also took matters into their own hands. Democrat and anti-unionist Tomas Sanchez, who was the sheriff of Los Angeles at the time, he's the gentleman on the far left with the beard. Well, both of them have a beard, the thicker beard. He actually helped organize what is known as the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles, a group of about 80 men, many of them of Latino or Spanish-speaking backgrounds. It is the only free state militia to fight for the American Civil War and marched to Texas with the famed General Albert Sidney Johnston after his resignation from the Department of the Pacific. Tomas Avila Sanchez, he did not actually go out to Texas. He continued to serve in Los Angeles, I believe it is until 1867. but nonetheless, he expressed his sympathies and helped organize this group, which again was a successful Confederate militia to form in a free state. And many other Mexican Americans, Californios, or Spanish speakers from the California region would also go and fight in favor of the Confederacy. And we'll see in favor of other groups as we continue in this discussion. I've noticed that 2 bubbles have popped up. Can you guys hear me?
Brian, we are hearing you. There have been 2 people that have indicated that they were having audio issues. I have sent messages to them independently, but we've had no issues with your audio that I've seen here.
Okay, good. I wanted to make sure. And if you guys have questions that pop up as I'm talking, feel free to put those in. I will save questions for the very, very end. Obviously, if you have technical difficulties though, David or anybody, please help me out with making sure to stop me.
Yeah.
And
yeah, we have had no problems with that. And if you do have any issues, I see several other people have said they had to start and rejoin to be able to get it, and that they're having no trouble with audio. So if you do have audio issues or troubles, just send me a message. You can send it to David, and you should see me at the top as the organizer. Send me a message. I'll be happy to be able to help. Otherwise, I'll let you know, Brian, if there is any problems, but there have been no issues from my side here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So, one more, sorry. No, it is this one, forgive me. The importance of the PICO's affirmation that they were supporting the Union, I cannot begin to express it enough. This was a family that was highly revered, not only among California populations, but also among people who were associated with the Mexican nation or were directly from Mexico. They saw these men as leaders of the Spanish-speaking community in California. And so their expression of unionist support, even though one was a Republican and then the other was a hardcore Shiv Democrat who supported the separation of California, not necessarily from the Union, but again, separating in half to form the territory of Colorado. Nonetheless, it speaks volumes, and the Spanish-speaking population would listen. The vast majority of the Spanish-speaking population did support the Union. Andres Pico stated, "I elected to become a member of the Confederation, adopting the citizenship of the same, of which I am proud. That although my political opinions as previously expressed have differed from those of the Republican Party, these considerations cease in the face of the attack made against the federal government. And unconditionally and at all hazards, I am for the Union entire, to maintain which I would cheerfully offer as a soldier my sword and as a citizen my fortune." Pio Pico would respond, "My acts and my vote placed in the ballot box in favor of the worthy President of the United States are faithful testimonials of my political opinions. To these I have now to add that although I lament the disturbances occasioned by the southern states, I approve the energetic measures adopted by the government for the preservation at all costs of the Constitution and the Union entire." The support of one of the most powerful Spanish-speaking families in the American Southwest no doubt helped secure the loyalty of many Native Californians and Latinos in the state. But as stated once before, loyalty was never fully guaranteed. This section, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that borderlands understanding and how this wasn't just a war between the Union and the Confederacy. In fact, this was a war between various groups. The 1st Battalion of the Native California Cavalry was among the most influential of the predominantly Latino battalions to serve in the Southwest during the Civil War. Originally supposedly supposed to be commanded by Don Andres Pico as the major, but he declined due to health. Recruitment began in 1863, around the middle of the war, and was finished off by 1864, and they served well into 1866. It comprised of 4 companies with the drum barracks as one of the main headquarters. And if you've never been to the drum barracks, I'm always going to put this in any talk I give, go to the drum barracks. It is my home away from home and an incredible place to learn about Civil War history in Los Angeles. The majority of the actions that these men of the 1st Battalion of the Native California Cavalry would see was in Arizona, and it wasn't necessarily against Confederate populations. In fact, the majority of these men saw their service in controlling the indigenous populations, including the Apache, most importantly, the Apache in the Arizona Territory. In some instances, they would come across other peoples, whether it be indigenous, or in some instances, very interesting instances, the imperial forces from Mexico. Cavalrymen like Juan de la Guerra, oh, and by the way, Salvador Vallejo ended up becoming the commanding major. He's the gentleman with the cane that you see there below General Mariano Vallejo. And as you could see, the family is in 4 different places, which I had shown you this graphic earlier in my talk. And again, it goes to show that this was a war on many fronts, and that involved many nations and many peoples, especially when you're referring to the American Southwest. You see Uladislao there is in Mexico, Californian, but nonetheless fighting in favor of Juarez. Cavalrymen like Juan de la Guerra took pride in their service in the 1st Battalion. De la Guerra proudly recalled how he thought he had the finest cavalry outfit in the whole world. Probably did. Such horses we had. His military service in the war years became deeply rooted in who he was. After the war, he, among other members of the 1st Battalion, joined the Grand Army of the Republic, a veterans association for Union soldiers. The Grand Army of the Republic, or GAR, not only served to preserve the fraternal bonds of war, but also to promote nationalist loyalty. Among the most important pillars of GAR ideology, loyalty. It is described in the GAR Blue Book as an effort to maintain true allegiance to the United States of America based upon a paramount respect and fidelity to its constitutions and laws, to discountenance whatever tends to weaken loyalty, incites to insurrection, treason, or rebellion, or in any manner impairs the efficiency and permanency of our free institutions, and to encourage the spread of universal liberty, equal rights, and justice to all men. Juan de la Guerra's military service and the post-war participation in the GAR expressed ideas of loyalty and nationalism towards the United States, a departure from the previous California perceptions of anti-American and anti-federalist sentiments. De la Guerra came from one of the most powerful and prominent of the California families, and nearly all of his family members participated in the Union cause in one capacity or another. Tom Przeleski, who wrote, where is it? I brought it with me. If you've never read this book, California Lancers, I highly recommend it. He writes, Mexican Americans were no longer merely a conquered people, but a constituency who demanded a seat at the table as fellow Americans. Furthermore, the 1st Battalion saw service in Mexico, fighting against Maximilian's raiding forces along the border. Historians Bautista and Przeleski repeatedly stress a relation between military service for American nationalism and military service for Mexican nationalism. Loyalties for both the United States and Juarista forces in Mexico were deeply connected to the lives of these men. For the Vallejos, this connection hit close to home. Salvador Vallejo served as commander to the battalion, while at the same time his nephew Uladislao fought with Juarista rebel forces in Mexico. California's many Spanish newspapers, of which produced in large participation by Californios, captured the flight of Mexican Californios and immigrants to fight in Mexico. La Voz de Mexico, which is the newspaper, reported, many of our fellow countrymen have gone back to take part in defense of our homeland. End quote. Sentiments like these reconnected the people of Mexican descent, like Californios, to the concept of a Mexican homeland. The service of Latino California men in both Mexican and American conflicts hint at the formation of a transnational identity, a blend of both nations. Furthermore, the shared experience of marginalization and two wars brought Californios and Mexicans in California closer together in the formation of Mexican-American communities. As I have noted, the United States was not the only North American country at war fighting for its identity in the 1860s. South of the United States, Mexico was in the midst of its own war. The Civil War weakened Monroe Doctrine, allowed for European influence in Latin America to take root once more. France established a monarchy in Mexico under Maximilian and deposed President Benito Juarez. Californios and Mexicans in California connected over what they believed as an infringement on the democratic values both nations were fighting to defend. Furthermore, for the Californios who once identified themselves as different to the Mexican people, the experience of joined racialization and marginalization in their own home of California joined these two together. Thus, war and injustice reconnected Californios to their Mexican cousins they once considered otro, or other. The reconnection between Californios, Mexicans, and other Latino groups in this period strengthened their voice in a repressive state. It is important to note that there was an influx of immigrants to California in the 1850s and 1860s that were not only from Mexico, but came from all over Latin America, including, but not limited to, Peru, Chile, and Argentina. And these, at least I know so far from Chile for sure, Chilenos did fight in the 1st Battalion of the Native California Cavalry. I can't remember if people from Peru or Argentina did, but I would believe that they did as well, since they were a population present there. Spanish language newspapers produced by Mexicans and Californios blossomed in this period, mobilizing Latinos towards Union and Confederate. Hint, hint, LA Star was not always the most unionist newspaper and was a bilingual newspaper, by the way, and also pushed them towards Juarista and even imperial French causes. Furthermore, juntas patrióticas, or patriotic assemblies as they would be known, designed to inspire Mexican nationalism, gained increased attention among Californio, Mexican, and even Native American populations. They celebrated American independence, Mexican independence, and even introduced the celebration of the victory at Puebla, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, 1862, as a staple celebration in the American Southwest, formalizing it as a truly Mexican-American tradition. The ethnic and national connection to the two wars and the shared experience of marginalization paved the way for stronger Latino communities in California and the West. Scholar David E. Hayes Bautista argues the formation of identity, ethnicity, and public memory was socially and deliberately constructed during the American Civil War by Latinos responding to the events and changes around them. Furthermore, he stresses this period as the beginning of one of the most fertile periods in Latino community organization, matched in magnitude perhaps only by the heady days of the Chicano movement in the late 1860s and early 1870s. I'm going to show you this little case example. These are two fascinating individuals. First, I'll mention the judge on the right. That's, oh my gosh, why is his name escaping me? Judge Sepulveda, who was definitely a very, very staunch Democrat, backed French forces in Mexico and actually was out there during that period of time. Not the most unionist gentleman. And there was this idea about if more individuals supported the imperial forces in Mexico, that then the imperial forces would support the Confederacy, both through weapons and other means. So there was definitely this desire by more unionist Californios to ensure that that doesn't happen, that the Republic of Mexico is secured under Juarez as rightfully is deserved, and that at the same time, by supporting Mexico, the Juarez forces in Mexico, you are also supporting the Union, because you're not allowing this imperial army or dictatorship to essentially assume to give aid to another enemy. So both are interconnected is kind of what I'm trying to say here. And Judge Sepulveda is kind of an exception in terms of what the other Californios were doing during this time period. other Californios were really trying to unite the Spanish-speaking populations under the cause of fighting for freedom and fighting for the liberty that they were guaranteed under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And no man, I feel, did it more than Francisco P. Ramirez, who's a very, very prominent politician and a journalist of the time period. He wrote El Clamor Público, which is a very famous newspaper of the 1850s, and continued to write into the 1860s and afterwards. But he states in this quote that you see above, "We are convinced that California is lost to all Hispanic Americans. Only Mexicans alone have been sacrificed on gallows raised to launch their poor souls into eternity. Is this the liberty and equality of the country we have adopted?" And he made sure to hold the United States accountable and to make sure that they're holding it accountable because not because he wants to leave, but because he wants to stay. And so his desire to remain in the Union, to encourage Unionist support, was a way also of rallying Latinos towards a political and social mobilization against something that they were promised. Article 9 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo says, "The Mexicans who in the territories aforesaid shall not preserve the character of the citizens of the Mexican Republic conformably with what is stipulated in the preceding article shall be incorporated into the Union of the United States and be admitted at the proper time to the enjoyment of all the rights of the citizens of the United States according to the principles of the Constitution, and in the meantime shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty and property and secured in the free exercise of their religion without restriction." And Ramirez saw that the United States was consistently violating that. And so he saw, like many political activists, that even today, that a way in which you could affirm yourself, that you could continue your cause and show your humanity is not by stepping back and letting, your dehumanization occur, but by mobilizing your communities, rallying together and fighting for a cause that you believe in. And he was very, very instrumental in uniting these. He was also very instrumental in forming those juntas patrióticas that I mentioned earlier, or these patriotic assemblies that really stressed the importance of having love for the homeland of Mexico, but at the same time love for the current homeland of the United States and inspiring Mexican-American nationalism. So this is the beginnings of this kind of Mexican-American identity. And one last thing that I will note here, well, I'll hold on that one for a bit. Let's move on. Okay, so I will note though that in this story, we do see incredible activism. Francisco Ramirez fought extensively against racism. He not only fought against the racism that was inflicted on Californios, Mexicans, and indigenous peoples, but he fought for the rights of Chinese people. He fought Chinese immigrants in California, as well as African Americans living in California. He saw that the cause of fighting for rights was not just one limited to the people who historically were in California for a long time, but also for those coming in, and made sure that they were protected as well. But we understand that in that case, he was affirming something that was a little bit radical for the time. So I will note that he was a little bit more radical than other Californios. And I mean that this borderless wars also notes that central to this is this idea that they also had the 1st Battalion of the Native California Cavalry had to launch the majority of their military actions against indigenous peoples. And it was a destructive action in many circumstances. General James Carleton, who assumed control of the New Mexico region and as well as Arizona Territory, really helped push this idea that the main invaders in this area that are threatening both the civilians, mining populations, as well as the military in the area, and are infringing on our ability to move Union forces in that area efficiently were the indigenous populations. And so Carleton really helped push the beginnings of what we would call the reservation system. And so it was not the most friendly. I didn't know that. We have a very favorable view of James Carleton at the drum barracks. So when I went to New Mexico and I took a tour of the museum, I was quite shocked with what I heard. And I highly recommend you see more of the, you learn more about what actually happened to the indigenous peoples done by the military in the American Southwest, because it's not a rosy picture. And how does this fit into the Californios? Well, essentially many Californios, Mexicans, and even Native Americans serving in the Union Army had to essentially wage war on a people who they shared cultural and ethnic similarities with. This inadvertently creates a new social order that advantages some brown communities while disadvantaging others. This differs from the California community building that we have seen previous, and instead looks at the development and maintenance of ethnic and racial borders as a method of surviving Americanization of California. Elizabeth Haas argues that with the American acquisition of California, race identity became central to the construction of national identity, with American being equated to whiteness. The notion of white racial superiority reaffirmed the equation of white with the American and citizen. Thus, it is my belief, evidenced by military, political, and social actions executed by Californios during the Civil War, that racial superiority was in part rooted in the transformation of California identity. Racist ideologies and the power dynamics enforced by Californios are uniquely a product of the legacy of New Spain's racial caste system and gente de razón ideology, as well as the process of adapting American nationalism and a desire for American homogeneity in the West. And so kind of what I mean by this is that in the racial caste system of New Spain, once Spain left, the racial caste system didn't leave. It was definitely there. And you even see it up into the Mexican Revolution in reaffirming what is the top racial caste, or what is one of the top racial castes. And some could argue that whiteness and Europeanness in Mexico, or color, still matters in Mexico today. There is still racism in Mexico and racial castes in Mexico. And this definitely plays a role in the development of California identity, in assuming in some instances a more European identity, ignoring the indigenous or mestizo, or in some instances, or even African past, and assuming whiteness. And you see that especially a lot in the testimonios that were gathered by the Bancroft Library in the later 19th century, where these Californios, a lot of California women especially, I don't know necessarily why, were very comfortable with saying, I come from a strong European stock. I'm of European stock. I am not one of those Mexicans, or I am not one of those Indios or gente bárbaros, barbarians. So they really made sure to delineate those lines. And they also helped start the beginning of the Spanish fantasy and recreating a more white perception of the Hispanic past. And in reality, the vast majority of people that came here when, quote unquote, the Spanish came, were a very diverse, very mixed group of people. They were not your traditional Spaniard, as you would assume. But I mention that because it is important and it can't be dismissed, but it's not so much the central part of what I'm talking about here. One of the interesting things to occur also during this time period is not only do you have wars happening below you, wars happening to the left of you, or rather to the east of you, but you also have things that are completely out of your control. The drought that began in 1862 and lasted until 1865 is important to understanding the implications of the destruction of the California economy and ranching culture. With the decimation of the cattle ranching industry the very livelihood Californios and their Spanish and Mexican ancestors held onto for hundreds of years, was in essence gone. What is a vaquero without his vacas? That was one of my first historical questions. What is a ranchero without his rancho? Another one of my historical questions, which I'm still working on. Unfortunately, in 1862, at the start of 1862, there was a period of severe flooding, nonstop rain. It did kill a bunch of the livestock in California. It also affected the way the military operated in California, believe it or not. Actually, the push to build the drum barracks was kind of motivated by the rains that occurred in early 1862. Camp Latham was just a tent city at the time. And with the increased rains, there was this desire to really build a more permanent military structure that could, survive the conditions. And we eventually get with the 59.4 acres of land that construct the approximately 22 buildings that form the drum barracks by 1864 and 1865, with the quartermaster's depot being built in 1862, so that year. But immediately after all this rain, then you move into a period of severe drought. And the estimates say that it goes until 1865, but more recent historians have said it probably went into 1867, as we still see lasting effects from our bigger drought that we had in the last decade, still kind of happening now, and we're going into another period of drought today. But I'll read you these quotes just so you get an understanding of what was happening. And it was happening all over California, as you see by, I have two in two different areas. We have had no rain yet. There is no grass and the cattle are very poor. Your rancho men report a great many dying. Should we have no rain, your cattle buyers will get nothing but hides and bones. C.R. Johnston, foreman to Don Abel Stearns, Los Angeles, 1863. The ground is very dry and yet and dusty. Many are becoming alarmed, for the safety and prosperity of the country depends upon having rain. California is suffering, for grain alone has nearly doubled in price, as also almost every other product. Cattle are dying for want of grass in many places. We had a little rain early in winter, but none lived. N.A. Chandler, Mining Observer, San Francisco, 1864. Various scholars have agreed that the loss of ranch lands, no matter how much Californios tried to hold on to them, was not possible in California's changing social and economic landscapes. Previous legislation and land speculation took much of the Californios' acreage, but the drought appeared the final nail to the coffin. The end of cattle ranching's prominence in California became reality in the midst of the American Civil War. Vital to this understanding is not only the implications of this disaster on ranching culture in general, but more specifically how it affected vaquero, or cowboy, identity. Historian Miroslava Chavez Garcia argues that both California Mexican men and women found ways to survive impoverishment and adapt to the changing economy. They took on jobs as unskilled laborers, seamstress, bricklayers, agricultural workers, washerwomen, and housekeepers, participating in the newly growing urban and agricultural economies of California. Furthermore, wool production also became a means through which California families could survive, could save California's ranchos. In September of 1862, the Los Angeles Star hailed the incredible efforts made by California ranchos in their efforts to increase wool production. The Star reported, "Wool has attained a prominence and importance truly astonishing to those who can look back on the olden times of the cow counties. Wool growing is now one of the most important interests in the country." End quote. Though much of the wool production began to occur in ranchos increasingly owned by Yankee businessmen, Californios, still under the possession of some of their rancho lands, small or large, sought to participate in the new wool economy as well. In a list of Los Angeles County wool producers, approximately 37% of the listed wool producers of Los Angeles County bear Spanish surnames. The list includes prominent Californios such as Pio Pico and Jose Maria Avila. These transitions indicate California adaptability to California's changing economy and culture, an exertion of California agency that definitively counters Leonard Pitt's thesis. Manuel Dominguez was one of the main people too that actually survived off of shifting from cattle over to sheep. Sheep in some instances were drought tolerant. They're raised throughout the American Southwest. The churro is one of the more famous ones that was raised here in California, as well as in New Mexico and Arizona, most famously by the Navajo. But there were varying degrees to Dominguez's success as well as to other rancheros. Unfortunately, to be able to shift from a cattle economy over to a sheep economy was very expensive. You lost your complete livestock almost, or completely, because of a drought, or a flood that was totally out of your control. So you lost money there. If you didn't know, something I should have mentioned earlier is that cattle hides really were an important economy of California. By this point, not as much, but nonetheless, they were really, really important. They were at one point known as California banknotes because of the extensive use in a trade and barter system, using them almost like money with incoming ships and exchanging for processed goods. But they also sold the tallow from the cattle. And then as we move into the gold rush period and the American acquisition of California, the Californios started sending the cattle north and using the cattle not only for the tallow and the hides, but using them also for the meat, which were once, the population of the Los Angeles basin in 1860 was about 11,000 people. The population of the Los Angeles Pueblo was about 4,000. And there were more cattle. So there weren't enough people to eat that amount of meat. It was a lot of meat and it would just be thrown into pits. But now with the mass influx of people coming into the north of the state, driving the cattle north and selling the meat was another revenue source for these ranching families, whether Californio or other. But now all that's gone. So sheep was one of the ways to accommodate. And as I mentioned before, Maria Slava Chavez Garcia also notes that they really accommodated themselves to the newly growing urban and agricultural economies of California and took up new jobs that were offered by the new American economy. So they reshifted. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to dive exactly into what vaqueros were thinking in this time period. A lot of them were illiterate, so I don't have those sources to be able to look at. But I could guess that they adapted, or I know that they adapted and took on new jobs. On the left, you could see some workers at the nearby rancho, which is right by me, Rancho Los Cerritos. The vast majority of the workers at Rancho Los Cerritos were of Mexican-American, Californio, and indigenous descent. And these men would not only do the ranching on the property, but they would also go travel in bands of what is known as sheep shearing bands, or these traveling groups from ranches to ranches throughout California and the American Southwest, offering their services of sheep shearing. And they were highly skilled in this. And if you want to learn more about that, go to Rancho Los Cerritos. That's another place I volunteer at. In conclusion, I'm just going to restate my argument and some of the things that I've been talking about, and then we'll move on into questions. During the American Civil War, Californios modified their identity to survive the changes and pressures faced in American California. For the Californios, their survival depended on their ability to combat the struggles of annexation and assert their right to land and citizenship. They demonstrated this through military participation, political activism, community building, economic adaptability, and racial reconstructions. Furthermore, these actions demonstrate a transformation in California identity as they increasingly adopted a transnational identity rooted in Mexico and the United States, what we would call Mexican American today. Mexican nationalism among Californios formed as a result of their shared experiences of marginalization and culture between them and Mexican immigrants in California. Stronger connections to American nationalism arose from a desire to challenge racial and ethnic inequality and ensure a seat at the table as fellow Americans. The rapid changes that occurred in this period, both in human and non-human control, pushed Californios to seek new ways of asserting their place in California. In the process, their actions played a vital role in the shaping of 19th century America. That is my talk. And now we can move into questions.
Okay, Brian, I do see one comment or question coming in the chat area in there. I would actually ask if anybody does have a question, you can unmute yourself and you can actually just pose the question verbally to Brian directly, or that you can type into the chat area. So the one comment that we have in there right now, and it comes from Robert Crook. Thanks for an extraordinary lecture, Brian. Going back to what you mentioned before, why do the proponents of the Grand Reconstruction narrative deem the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo as the start of Reconstruction, as opposed to the Louisiana Purchase, an earlier event that included the incorporation of French and Spanish nationals? Many of the problems and issues experienced by Californios bear similarities with these people living in Louisiana Territory.
Well, it's just like.
Oh. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. There is some crosstalk. I would ask if you are not speaking or asking a question, if you could just mute yourself. I will mute the stray audio coming in, but yes, we can hear you, Brian.
Okay. I want to make sure that I say everything right. Okay. Okay, so that's a good question, and I'm glad that you say that. In terms of the Louisiana Purchase, one of the things that, I mean, the historians that I looked at, which is Elliot West, Daniel Lynch, I forgot his first name, but Masick. One of the central things that they really didn't talk about that, and one of the reasons that I would assume why they didn't say that going back to the Louisiana Purchase and assuming you have a vast amount of indigenous peoples, you do have Spanish-speaking populations and French, is because the scale of it wasn't as large. And I'll read you a direct quote. This period led to a new racial order that advantaged some and disadvantaged others. West argues the formation of a more perfect union was not only rooted in the period of the Civil War, but rather westward expansion, as much as the conflict of North and South had changed up matters and pushed us towards the formation of American modernity. This changes the narrative that the Civil War served as a catalyst for American cohesion and modernity, and rather extends the temporal scale of the development to the Mexican Cession. In doing so, this approach recognizes the racial diversity and racial fluidity of the West, which is in contrast to the black and white narratives offered by previous historians that saw the development of the West as only rooted in the racial discourse of Southern slavery. You know what? You win on this one, because I think you could totally extend that to the Louisiana Purchase. And I'm going to send an email to Daniel Lynch and say, why is that not the case that it can extend to the Louisiana Purchase? I don't think I could speak for the Louisiana Purchase in terms of all the peoples that were assumed under that in comparison to what was assumed under the Mexican Cession. So I don't think I could properly give you a response, but I'm happy for the inquiry. So I want to look further into that. Thank you.
Next question comes from Laura. Actually, two questions about your sources. Please, so I can do more reading. Is the Grand Reconstruction narrative in Eric Fournier's work, and on what source about the cattle hides as California banknotes? Thanks.
Okay. A source for hides as California banknotes. That's something I've always said for a long time, so I can't. I don't have the footnote off the top of my head, and that's the term that was used for them. If you want to learn more about kind of the cattle ranching economy, it's on the tip of my tongue. I could also send out a bibliography, but Decline of the Californios is one of the main ones that gives you really an introduction into who these people were, even though I'm challenging some of the arguments that are made in it. In general, it is an excellent read and really gives you a perspective of who these people were. So that's a good intro. I want to say Cattle on a Thousand Hills. I might be totally wrong, but that's the one that pops to mind. But really any reading on the California cattle ranching industry, that will usually pop up, the California banknotes saying.
The other question in there was regarding the Grand Reconstruction narrative. Is that from Eric Foner's work? Or where did that come from was the other question. With that.
Yes, Eric Foner is an excellent historian. But no, the Greater Reconstruction really comes out of Elliot West, or at least that's who I looked at in order to get an understanding of it. And then historian Daniel Lynch, who wrote an excellent dissertation on California, on the California Shiv Alliance, and kind of what that meant to them. So I would look at, again, Elliot West, Reconstructing Race, and then Daniel Lynch's dissertation, Southern California Chivalry, the Convergence of Southerners and Californios in the Far Southwest, 1846 to 1866. And that was the UCLA dissertation from 2018. And then Reconstructing Race was in Western Historical Quarterly, spring 2003.
The next question is from Janet and was asking, who is the woman pictured in your last slide?
You know what? I'm so glad you mentioned that, Janet, because I was supposed to talk about her, and I completely blanked out. It's Arcadia Bandini. So originally, in my original thesis, I wanted to really stray away from telling the traditional male elite centered narrative to really try to tell one that is more inclusive of all the peoples that were participating in this process, and include women too, that there is an aspect of gender that is really important here. And I was really inspired by Chavez Garcia's Negotiating Conquest, which is an excellent book about women in California. But Arcadia Bandini is probably the most successful woman of the California women in the American period. She was quite the entrepreneur, did well at managing the rancho. And this was a situation that many women had to face. When their husbands died or their husbands weren't around, they basically had to assume possession of their ranchos. And unfortunately, I don't think I've done sufficient research into this. And part of that involved me going into the archives, which are unfortunately closed. But nonetheless, I still wanted to make the point that women like her, again, were accommodating to this new situation where, in Arcadia's case, marrying a Yankee gentleman, and then now taking his role, right, his position, and having quite a substantial prominence in places, in major cities like Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, Monterrey, and even in some cases, San Francisco, and in terms of social and political conversations that are taking place. So women are also taking a seat at the table, and that's kind of my reason for having her in there. And they also had to deal with the situation of the drought. So they had to navigate all this. It wasn't just a male-centered job.
Next question comes from Chris, asking, Brian, can you address Los Angeles being a hotbed of pro-Southern sentiment and the role that the press played in this endeavor?
Yeah, so if you ever take a tour with me at the Drum Barracks, you know, it's one of my favorite things to talk about. There's several things that are connected to this. As I mentioned in the talk, Californios were losing their lands in the north. People like Vallejo were seeing squatters on their property, especially in mining regions, and they had to challenge that. And most often, again, the land laws didn't always necessarily protect the Californios as was promised. And so a lot of them ended up moving south. There was a lot larger Spanish-speaking population. I always refer to give you an understanding of what Los Angeles was like at the start of the Civil War. I always say it looks more like a sleepy pueblo in northern Mexico than it does anything an American city or ideas of an American city. It's primarily constructed of adobe, lead tiled roofs, or just wooden roofs, or even in some cases thatch roofs. So it's not the American modern city that we see in occurring in an industrial nation during this time period. So we have the Spanish population, right? The Spanish-speaking population that's there. They see that Northern California is benefiting primarily from the tax revenue. All the citizens in places like San Francisco are benefiting off of the state of California's wealth. It's one of the largest economies in the world, actually the 5th largest economy in the world. Gold really thrust it forward. And it wasn't just the gold itself, it was all the business, the capitalism that happens around that really helped boost California's wealth. And the Californians are like, well, we're not benefiting off of any of this. And so that's where you kind of get the PICO Act and this desire of wanting to reaffirm control of California, even if it's just the southern half. And so necessary to that was this SHIV, very, very hardcore pro-slavery alliance with the Democratic Party, or the SHIV faction of the Democratic Party. And that's more the California aspect. Or the Spanish-speaking population, because there were Mexicans and indigenous peoples that spoke Spanish that supported the Democrats. Again, in some instances, more sketchy reasons why they supported them, but I think you could see reasons for them supporting it. But there was also Southerners moving into California. And one of the central things I had mentioned, the camel guy, Edward Fitzgerald Beale, we have the creation of the Overland Mail Route, which is this basically established road that directly connects the southeast of the United States to now the southwest of the United States. And there's constant flow of peoples moving back and forth. And a lot of the population, the American population that ended up settling in Southern California were from the American South, and they inevitably brought their ideas into Los Angeles and into Southern California. And their politics dominated the state for a long time.
So I did want to mention, I do see some people posting the same comment or question a couple of times. I am reading them. If you have sent it to the organizer or sent it to everyone, I am reading them in the order that they have come in. So if you're wondering why your question hasn't been read, it's probably because that there were others that got in ahead of you. So I apologize about yours not being there at this point, but we are reading them in the order that they've come in. There are a couple of comments going back to the question on the banknote. Laura says, thanks. A lot of people cite the banknote, but I've not been able to see a source. And then Chris says, refer to Richard Henry Dana, 2 years before the master of banknotes.
That's correct. Thank you. That's a great primary source. He hated it here, but that's a great primary source.
There is another comment on there that from Stuart. In a previous message I had sent to Brian requesting, he explained how Californios lost their right to Spanish land grants in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
Okay, so the treaty didn't necessarily, that wasn't what made them lose their right to their land. In reality, the treaty was meant to protect their land, their rights as citizens of the United States. And they had the right to choose to go back to Mexico or to stay. They had a right to do that as well. What we really get is land speculation, issues of land speculation. And again, a lot of this was pushed by the Democrats during this time period. William Gwynn, I believe that's his name, who I mentioned earlier, was one of the main proponents of the land law to essentially speculate over whether the Californios have control of their original land grants or not. And a lot of those questions, they really came up when people started to question them. So it wasn't always that like there was a full review and every single person had to go before a judge. It wasn't that wasn't the case. It was the case that people challenged it. And in the case of the northern areas, as I gave the example before, you have squatters on the ranch lands that are saying, hey, well, you know what? I think this is mine. This doesn't belong to anybody. And then you have to bring the old Spanish land grant or the Mexican land grant. That's, I don't know if you've ever looked them up, but if you've ever go on to Calisphere and look up a Mexican land grant or a Spanish land grant, and they're not your American map. And that definitely played a problem into the speculation as to what you own or what you don't own. Originally, it was definitely on an honor system. A lot of it worked like a feudal society, Spanish and even Mexican era California, where you honor and you respect the lords and ladies of your nearby ranchos, and you respect that from this boundary, from this tree to those hills, belongs to Sepulveda or Dominguez or Pico, or if it's Yankee, Temple, Stearns, or whoever else. But they weren't clearly defined lines, and that posed a problem. And in situations where Californios didn't necessarily have the economic funds to support continuous engagement in the legal fight, then they would unfortunately lose the fight and lose their land. Now, the majority, I will state that the majority of Californios did get to keep their lands to a certain extent, but not the majority of their lands. So land was lost, and that is important to note. But it wasn't the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that caused it. The treaty was supposed to protect it. It was the land laws, Democrats, and then the influx of people coming for the gold rush that inevitably pushed that land to be speculated.
A few more questions and a few comments as well. From Anne, Arcadia, is it named after her? I'm assuming it's referring to the woman in the on the slide that you're currently showing on the screen there.
I would think so, but I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. I don't think I could give you a definitive answer. I haven't looked into that. But George, I would think so. And we see a lot of California names throughout California.
If there was only a way to be able to look online and to be able to find out such a thing.
Yeah, somebody look it up.
George says, dear Mr. Chavez, excellent presentation. Thank you. And
my pleasure.
Laura says, confirmation of land titles was through the Land Act of 1851, lengthy confirmation process. And Robert says, Anne, I believe Arcadia was a place in Greece. So we have some conflict there. Chris is saying, with the drought destroying the cattle industry in Southern California and the sheep wool emerging as a profitable export in the 1860s, can you expand on this issue and the fact that the Union had blockaded cotton as an export in the South?
Oh, I am so glad that you mentioned that. Yeah, I mean, excellent observation. Wool actually started to become more popular during the course of the Civil War. You need to make uniforms, and also you need to make civilian clothes. So wool production definitely increased during the Civil War as a result of the inability to get a lot of cotton like you originally had access to prior to the Civil War. So yes, that is related to that.
Those are the questions and comments that I have. I don't know if there any came in to you directly, or if anybody else has any, you're certainly welcome to be able. Actually, we just had another one coming in now. A couple of ones coming in right together. From Juan, thank you for a very fascinating presentation. And from Roy, the presentation of yours is excellent. It raises some issues that I grew up with. Hold on just a moment. Let me capture. We're getting some audio feedback here. Let me grab that real quick. Apologize about that. Roy is stating the presentation was excellent. I grew up in Los Angeles as a child in the 1940s. I'm an original Californian and have always wanted to know more about the Spanish influences that I was exposed to. I grew up in Westchester, Joe, I see your audio. We're not hearing you directly. We are hearing some noise coming in from you, so you may need to call in. But we were not hearing you directly. We're just hearing some background noise. To continue with what Roy was saying in there, grew up in Westchester and was part of the Rancho Bolaño that was still crop farming with several stables around what was an excellent. What was the extent of the Confederate States of America's influence in the Los Angeles area? How intrusive was the slave market in Southern California, and was it brought by the Spanish trade, and was there also existence in the Caribbean trade? Were the Spanish ranchos lost because of political changes brought about by a U.S. expansion in the South? Lots of comments, lots of questions going there.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so where do I start? So I know Rancho Bologna. That also incorporates Culver City. Because Rancho Bologna is where Camp Latham was.
Yeah.
But
yeah, Brian, it's actually pronounced Bayona.
That's
Rancho
right.
Bayona.
I know. You said, yeah. What was the extent? And there's Bayona Creek too. Which
Oh
was
yeah.
on the way to UCLA. What was the extent of CSA influence in the Los Angeles area? So luckily, there Confederates, active Confederates, I would say, that we are, let's say, coming from the Confederacy and fighting here. That didn't happen. That Confederates formed here. There were Confederates that formed here. Again, the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles. We also had Confederate generals or ranking officers that were here in the area that eventually went east. And some famously, which were friends with Winfield Scott Hancock and have been romanticized as having a dinner with Hancock before leaving off to fight for the Confederacy. I don't know the validity of those claims, but who knows? Albert Sidney Johnston is one of them. But we also have Confederate families that live here in Los Angeles and had relatives fighting over there while the rest of the family stayed here. Albert Sidney Johnston is one of those examples. Albert Sidney Johnston's family is buried here in Los Angeles. After the Civil War, however, that's a totally different case. You get this idea that the West is a place for good health and rehabilitation. You just went through a tremendously costly, devastating war, both physically and emotionally, as well as obviously taxing on the Union. But it was devastating. And so people needed to find peace. They needed to find a way to relax, especially in the later years. And California kind of became that oasis. And that was kind of also the push for Soldiers Home, or Sawtelle, as some of you might know, in Santa Monica area, or the Brentwood area by UCLA. That came up out of a need to have these Civil War veterans, in that case, Union veterans, come over here and in some ways rehabilitate and also recall the fondness of brotherly or fraternity. And we also, as equally as we had Union soldiers come over here, we had Confederate soldiers, and you get those cases all over California, especially in Orange County. And that's why we also have, well, I don't know so much anymore, but there used to be Confederate memorials in Los Angeles as well, because there was a Confederate population that came here after the Civil War. So how intrusive was the slave market in Southern California? Was it brought to Mexico and Southern California by the Spanish trade that was also existent in the Caribbean trade? Okay, so there's a lot there. So the majority of the slavery that occurred here in the Spanish colonial period was indigenous slavery. It was a part of the mission system, and then eventually the ranchos as well. The ranchos, it was a little bit different, but along a similar line of kind of you work for an individual, And in return, that individual will take care of you, is kind of the promise. Not necessarily for monetary gain, but that the individual will take care of you, similar to the hacienda system that we have in Mexico up until the turn of the century that leads to the Mexican Revolution. Slavery was outlawed by the Mexican state. The Californios promised to ensure that indigenous peoples got their land back, but we understand that that didn't fully happen, and that in some ways the legacy of Spanish colonialism continued. But it's important to also understand that these individuals were very diverse, as I mentioned before. They came from African backgrounds. Pio Pico is an excellent, the Pico family is an excellent example. They were Spanish, indigenous, and African. So they came from all over. And that also shows the diversity of New Spain. New Spain was a very, very diverse empire of very diverse peoples, languages, cultures, and colors of skin. So there was this idea, which I mentioned in the aspect where you have the brown other kind of hinging on the brown other and saying, well, in order for me to assert myself, I have to put you down. And that did happen, unfortunately. And it happened both militarily, it happened in the ranchos, it happened early on in the missions, but it happened to varying degrees. Now, slavery into the American period, there were attempts by Southerners to bring slaves over here. Biddy Mason is an excellent example of that. But they almost always won their court cases, which is amazing, especially when the Democrats, especially the Schiff faction of the Democratic Party, ruled California. It's pretty surprising that nonetheless, when African Americans, enslaved African Americans, were brought to Southern California, or California in general, they almost always granted their rights. Not all the time. We did have some people that were still in bondage and kind of secretly. And some of that slavery also existed amongst Union officers in Arizona and the New Mexico territory. We see that not only enslavement of Black individuals, but the enslavement of indigenous peoples. And that also happened here in California during the American period. And the Greaser laws kind of allowed people to do that, where these men would be essentially imprisoned for seeming not able to appear, or for not appearing decent or appearing indecent, and they could be arrested for just about anything, including the color of their skin, in which case they could also be sold at auction at any point, and that also happened. So there was ways in which they legally got away with slavery during this time period, though it's not the Southern slavery that we see in the South.
Yeah.
And then, yes.
Yeah, I want to say this. I've been doing a lot of research on my wife's side of the family. She had several Confederate Army personnel that were in Alabama as well as Arkansas. Interestingly enough, she's also Choctaw, Cherokee, and Creek. And I discovered the Choctaws also had Black slaves quite extensively, even during the period of time prior to 1838, 39, when they were moved out by the 1835 Relocation Act that President Jackson had signed. And there's a number of them that also were had the slaves until after the proclamation was filed, and eventually they were on their own, not quite sure what they were going to do now that they were freed from the land. But I was going to say that even in my dad's family, going way back, we have at least 4 relatives who were bonded to the plantations for a period of time because they stole stuff, a loaf of bread or whatever. King George I was in a big hurry to get rid of all the violators of the law. And that's how they ended up both here in the colonies as well as in Australia. So
yeah,
this whole thing is really a big issue.
Yeah, yeah, and I will note that Mexican Americans also own slaves in the United States,
Yeah,
primarily between Arizona and Texas. But that did happen, especially in Texas. There were Tejanos, as they were known,
yeah,
uh, that had slaves.
Mhm.
yeah. Well, these the Choctaws were in Indian Territory, in Choctaw Nation, and they had slaves there as well.
Yeah.
Up until there were, the proclamation of 1863, but or four, I mean. But it's when I see what's going on today, I always have to reflect back to how different things were, and yet how little people have learned from these histories. They're so important. And what you are presenting here tonight is extremely important to me. And it's
Oh,
important to a lot of people. I really appreciate this. I'm kind of hoping that eventually you're going to end up going towards your doctorate in this area.
well,
And the
hopefully,
last point I'll make is that I know Victor Davis Hanson. I don't know if the rest of you know who he is, but fifth generation Swede living up in Selma, living in the same house, as a matter of fact. And as a child in the 1970s, early 70s, all of his neighbors were farmers, mostly fruit trees, vineyards, raisins, that sort of stuff. And they lost their farms, and the farms were actually bought back, and they're all owned by Mexican Americans. And he found that that's really very interesting, how they're repopulating and getting back to the way things were once upon a time. And they're a very important part of our economy. So, and that's something that he would tell you.
mhm. Wow.
But
Well,
anyway,
thank you so much. Yeah, and
sure.
I see a lot of you have given many thanks to me. Well, many thanks to you for letting me talk. It's been an absolute privilege, and it's been fun because again, I've reshifted the focus of my thesis a little bit. It's going to be a little bit more locally centered here in the Los Angeles basin compared to looking at larger California. And it's going to be looking at more specific families, so not as broad as originally intended. So it was nice to redo some of this research and relook into this and tell a story. That's my favorite part. I always say that my favorite part about working in museums is telling stories and having an ability to have the art of storytelling, because
Yeah.
it's a fun engagement with others. And I
Yeah.
think you. I remember you from the Montebello Historical Society.
Yeah. Brian, there was a family that owned a ranch. I knew of the Lopez family, and their ranch was actually in and around Bayona Creek, in the Culver City area and to the west of Culver City, almost all the way to.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, it was adjacent to the old Hughes Aircraft Company
Oh, that's right.
property
Yeah.
now. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And eventually they ended up bringing all their goods, particularly corn and pumpkins and whatever, from Newhall. That's where they relocated, and that's where they did a lot of their farming for years.
Oh, wow.
Now, the farm is gone here locally. I don't know if they still exist in Newhall, but I'm sure you can find them, and I'm sure you can. They've been here many generations. I'm sure you can get a lot of information from
Oh,
them.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember his first name. Mother and husband had several children and a very extensive family, but Lopez.
You know what's funny is that one of the things that motivated me also to look into this is not only when my professor confronted us with the question, what does it mean to go to sleep one day a Mexican or Californio and then to wake up an American? But also I was at the Temple Homestead and I was taking a tour of the Casa Grande, and the person who was giving me the tour was a descendant of Workman Temple, and I was like, I had this moment. I didn't say it to her, but I was like, wow, you guys are still here. And so I had this, like, how cool, like that really counters this idea that these populations declined and just went away and never had a role in California ever again. Instead, it shows that they're still here. They're still actively participating in making California as much as anybody of us.
It's the Dominguez family still who, the university was built, usually Dominguez Hills, on property that was part of their ranchero. Now, I don't know if the family's still here or not, but
I'm not sure, but
yeah.
I'm pretty sure they are.
Well, you got a lot of work to do to recover all this.
Oh yeah, it is a big, yeah.
And you're young enough to do it.
Too. I'm waiting for the archives to open up.
Yeah, I know. I'm waiting to get back to LDS so I can do more of my research. It's just, it's limited. You can only get so much off the internet. But you actually, a good place to go, and I'm sure you've been there, is the Los Angeles Central Library downtown, all the way down the 6th floor, straight down in the pit.
that place is amazing. Yeah.
It is. It's absolutely amazing. But anyway, I don't want to hold you up anymore, but I appreciate this, and this is very good presentation. And I hope you come back with some more information someday.
Thank you. Hopefully, I'll present the final thesis.
Great.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for this talk tonight. This has been really unusually informative, and I really hope to see the final version of your work.
Oh, great. I'm so happy.
I would like to see it too.
Thank you for letting me be here. Yeah, I'll make sure to keep, I mean, I know I have contacts with Janet for sure, and now with David.
Yeah.
I'll make sure I keep you guys updated.
Sure.
Yeah, please do. Please do. I think California is a very, very important in our history here in this state.
Kathleen is making a comment that there are 500 descendants of the Dominguez family from 2 daughters, and next year they'll have a family reunion on the grounds of the Adobe.
Oh, how cool.
That's great. Yeah.
You guys.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions for Brian here? I did record this too, by the way, so we will be posting this a bit later. If you would like to be able to review it or share it with somebody that wasn't able to be here. And if we do have any other comments or questions, please feel free to be able to jump in now before that we let Brian go here.
Thanks, David. It's time for me to leave and go to bed.
Very well. So it's nice to meet you and Chris. So thank you, Kathleen and Chris, for jumping in, and thank you to everybody. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Brian.
Well, thank you so much for this talk, Brian. And we'll see you again when the drum reopens.
Yes.
Right. That probably won't be till next summer.
Right.
I know.
Great things are going. It's sad, but that's what's going on. I can only say that I talked to my daughter. Her husband is a senior cancer researcher, and he does a lot of. He's involved in this COVID-19 research right now, and he doesn't expect to see much more that's going to really be positive change and getting rid of this thing until probably April. Yeah. So in the meantime, we all hunker down. That's all.
Yeah, be safe, everybody. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All of you be safe, and especially those of you who are my age. I'm 80, so.
Oh yes, please be safe.
Take care. Take care. All
right,
thanks, David. Take care, Brian.
Good night.
Bye.